A voice whispered right next to my ear, "Only when he dies, this house will finally be ours." I froze. That was my daughter-in-law. And my son? He just bowed his head in silence. I lay motionless on the hospital bed. Everyone thought I couldn't hear a thing. But the heart of a father can never be mistaken. This betrayal will be exposed. Want to know what happened when I came back? Hit subscribe and follow now. My name was Robert Miller, and by the time I turned 62, life had carved more lines into my face than any chisel I ever held on a construction site. My hair had turned silver like the dust that clung to my boots after long days of labor, and my body carried the lean toughness of a man who had built more walls than he had ever lived behind. I had once believed that sweat was the only inheritance worth passing on. I worked, I sacrificed, and I raised my son, Daniel, with the stubborn hope that he would never have to carry bricks beneath the merciless Texas sun the way I did. Linda, my wife, used to warn me that I was pouring too much of myself into the boy, like a well that would one day run dry. She was right. When cancer took her, I had nothing left to give except everything I had already given. Daniel became the single star in my night sky, and I steered my whole life by his light. When the time came for college, I sold the last piece of earth that tied me to my father, 10 acres of stubborn land, dotted with mesquite trees and stones that refused to move. Signing those papers felt like tearing a page from my own history book. My hands shook, but my heart swelled with hope. Daniel promised he would never forget. He walked across that graduation stage years later in a polished suit, while I clapped until my palms burned, convinced my sacrifice had built him wings. After Linda's death, Daniel and his wife, Melissa, invited me to live with them. At first, I thought it was kindness. Their house stood proud in a suburban neighborhood, neat lawns and shining floors like something out of a glossy magazine. Melissa greeted me with a smile, but it was the kind of smile that never touched her eyes. She was elegant, stylish, the type of woman who measured life in appearances. To her, I was an old coat, hung in the wrong closet, tolerated but unwanted. I tried to shrink myself, to live like a ghost at the edge of their home. I kept to my room, ate little, spoke less, hoping silence could buy acceptance. But silence only fed Melissa's disdain. Her words were daggers wrapped in silk. She would complain about the cost of food when I left a meal unfinished, or sigh loudly about how peaceful the house used to be. Daniel sat through it all, quiet as stone, his eyes glued to a glowing phone screen. His silence hurt more than her words ever could. At night, I lay awake and stared at the ceiling, remembering the boy who once clutched my hand and promised he'd make me proud. I searched for that boy in the man across the dinner table, but he was gone, buried under ambition and apathy. Melissa, on the other hand, made no secret of her feelings. To her, I was temporary, like an old chair cluttering her perfect living room, waiting to be carried out. Still, I endured. Endurance was all I had ever known. I told myself families were imperfect, that love could be quiet. I held on to fragile hope, the kind that fluttered like a moth against the glass, faint, desperate, but alive. I prayed for a word of gratitude, a touch of warmth, something to remind me that blood still meant bond. But what I heard instead were whispers about nursing homes, spoken just loudly enough for me to catch. Melissa suggested it, with the casualness of tossing away leftovers, and Daniel answered with silence. That silence was colder than any winter I had known, and in that cold I realized the truth. My sacrifices had not built a bridge for my son to walk toward me. They had built a cage where I sat alone, waiting for a kindness that would never come. I thought my sacrifices would earn me gratitude, but I was wrong. It was one of those autumn evenings when the air outside carried the scent of dried leaves and wood smoke, a smell that always reminded me of home, of simpler days when Linda would simmer stew on the stove and Daniel would sprawl across the floor with his toy trucks. But that night, in my son's living room, warmth was nowhere to be found. The house looked polished, the chandelier casting golden light across the dinner table, but beneath the surface there was a chill sharper than the wind howling beyond the windows. Melissa sat at the head of the table, her back straight like a ruler, eyes scanning the plates as though she were inspecting soldiers for flaws. Daniel sat across from me, chewing quietly, his gaze drifting anywhere but toward me. The silence broke when Melissa's fork clinked against her plate. She looked directly at me, her voice smooth but edged with disdain. "Robert, you waste too much food. Every week I see leftovers in the fridge that no one eats. Do you know how much that costs us?" Her words were not loud, but they sliced cleanly through the room, leaving no space for defense. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, though I had barely touched my plate. The truth was, my appetite had faded with age. Food no longer held the joy it once did. But before I could speak, Daniel kept his eyes fixed on his plate, as though the table itself had stolen his attention. I wanted him to say something. Anything. To remind Melissa that I had raised him, that a few scraps of uneaten food were nothing compared to the meals I had skipped to make sure he never went hungry as a boy. But his silence roared louder than any accusation. I lowered my head, pushing peas across my plate, shrinking into the chair, as if becoming smaller might shield me from the sting of her words. My fork trembled in my hand, and for the first time, I felt like a guest at a table I once believed was mine. The rest of dinner passed in uneasy quiet. Melissa tapped her nails against the table, a steady rhythm that reminded me of raindrops on a roof during a storm, insistent and unrelenting. Daniel glanced at his phone twice, each time finding refuge in the glowing screen rather than in his father's eyes. I chewed slowly, swallowing more than food, swallowing pride, swallowing grief, swallowing the bitter taste of being unwanted. When Melissa stood to clear the plates, I tried to help, but she waved me off with a thin smile that held no kindness. "Don't bother," she said. "You'll just get in the way." Later that night, I walked past their bedroom door, half closed but not enough to hide the sound of voices. Melissa's words floated into the hallway, light and casual, like a knife slipped between ribs. "He's getting harder to manage, Daniel. Maybe we should start looking into nursing homes." My chest tightened. I stopped in the hall, holding my breath, waiting, hoping for my son's reply to be one of protest, one of loyalty. But all I heard was a low hum, the kind of sound a man makes when he doesn't want to fight, when silence is easier than truth. I stood there for a long moment, the weight of the house pressing down on me. The air felt heavy, thick with betrayal. My heart pounded not from anger, but from a hollow ache that spread through my chest. I thought of Linda then, of how she would have marched into that room and reminded Daniel of his duty, of his promises. But Linda was gone, and I was alone in that hallway, nothing more than a shadow listening to the crumbling of the life I had built. From that night on, the whispers never stopped. They slipped into the air during dinner, while Melissa folded laundry, even as Daniel poured his morning coffee. "It would be better for everyone if he had proper care," Melissa would say. "He's just taking up space." And always Daniel would remain silent, his face a mask I could no longer read. That silence hollowed me out, piece by piece, until I wondered if my son had already buried me in his heart, long before my body gave out. I began to retreat further into myself, afraid that every word I spoke, every step I took, would be counted against me. I moved through the house like a ghost, careful not to leave traces, careful not to invite their disapproval. I sat in my room most evenings, staring at old photographs, Linda's smile, Daniel's young face, the three of us on picnics by the lake. The boy in those pictures had once clung to my hand as though I were his whole world. Now he couldn't even meet my eyes across a dinner table. Still, I clung to hope. Hope was stubborn, like the weeds that grew between cracks in the pavement, no matter how many times they were pulled. I told myself Melissa's words were nothing but frustration, that Daniel's silence was only exhaustion from work. I told myself families argue, families strain, but blood always remembers. Yet deep inside, a quiet voice whispered a different truth, that sometimes blood forgets, and when it does, the wound runs deeper than any stranger's betrayal. I never thought those whispers about nursing homes would turn into my harshest reality. The days after that night in the hallway became heavier, as though each sunrise dragged a new weight onto my shoulders. I tried to move quietly through the house, stepping softly so the floorboards would not creak, breathing lightly so as not to disturb the air they breathed. I felt less like a father, less like a man, and more like a ghost wandering halls that no longer welcomed me. Every time I caught my reflection in the polished kitchen window, I hardly recognized the face staring back, eyes sunken, shoulders bent, a figure shrinking under the invisible burden of being unwanted. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, Melissa didn't bother with whispers. Her voice carried clearly, crisp and sharp like broken glass. "Daniel, this can't go on forever. Your father needs more care than we can provide. We're too busy, and frankly, it's becoming a burden. A nursing home would be better for all of us." She spoke as if I weren't even in the room, as if I were a piece of furniture to be discussed and discarded. Daniel sat there, lips pressed together, staring at the television, though it wasn't even turned on. I waited for him to speak, to say my name, to remind Melissa that I was still his father. But his silence filled the room like smoke, suffocating and inescapable. I looked at him, the boy I had once carried on my shoulders, the man I had once believed would carry my memory with pride, and all I saw was distance. I wanted to shout, to remind them that I had sold land drenched in my father's sweat so Daniel could study, that I had traded my heritage for his future. But the words lodged in my throat, heavy as stones. Instead, I sat there, small and motionless, like an old clock on the mantelpiece that no longer kept time tolerated for nostalgia's sake, but useless, waiting to be taken down. Nights became the hardest. I lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant tick of the hallway clock, and the faint laughter of Daniel and Melissa behind their closed door. That laughter once would have warmed me, but now it felt like a reminder that joy belonged to them, not to me. I was an intruder in their happiness, a shadow cast across their perfect lives. And yet, I endured. I endured because hope, foolish and fragile, still clung to me. Hope that Daniel would wake one morning and remember the boy he had been, the boy who once promised never to forget. But deep inside, I knew the tide had already turned. Their whispers had sharpened into conversations, their conversations into plans. I never thought those whispers about nursing homes would turn into my harshest reality. The whispers about nursing homes had already carved deep cracks into my heart. But what came next widened them into chasms I could not ignore. It began quietly, in ways so small that at first I almost dismissed them. One morning, while shuffling through the mail, I noticed an envelope missing. I knew it had been there the day before, a letter from the hospital reminding me of a routine checkup. My heart had been troubling me for weeks, but I said nothing, unwilling to add to their complaints. Yet when I asked about the letter, Melissa's expression hardened. She shrugged, careless, and said, "Maybe you misplaced it. You forget things all the time." The words struck like frost against my skin. Her tone wasn't concerned. It was dismissive, deliberate. Days later, I overheard her in the kitchen, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Only when he dies will we finally have this house to ourselves." I froze in the hallway, breath caught in my throat. She said it so plainly, like stating the weather, as though my existence was not flesh and blood, but merely an obstacle, a shadow blocking her sunlight. I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself. I wanted to walk in, to confront her, to demand Daniel stand beside me. But my feet rooted to the floor, as though the house itself held me prisoner. My son's response was silence again, always silence. That silence screamed louder than her words. The weight of it all gnawed at me. My body began to fail under the strain. My heart felt heavy, like a stone dragging against my ribs. My hands trembled when I held a cup of tea, and my legs grew weaker each time I tried to stand. I told myself it was just age, but in truth, I knew the storm inside me was building. One evening, as I sat in the living room trying to catch my breath, the world tilted. My vision blurred, my chest clenched, and a searing pain shot down my arm. I collapsed, the sound of my fall echoing through the house like a tree splitting in the wind. Melissa's scream pierced the air, not with concern but with annoyance, as if my body had chosen the most inconvenient time to betray me. Daniel rushed in, his face pale, his phone already in his hand, dialing for help. Yet even in that moment, I saw no fear of losing me, no grief, only irritation, only the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. At the hospital, the sterile lights blazed above me, harsh and unfeeling. Doctors rushed around, their voices a blur. "He needs immediate surgery," one of them said. "We require consent from the family." My eyes fluttered open just long enough to see Daniel and Melissa standing at the foot of the bed. Their faces were carved from stone. "No," Melissa said firmly, her arms crossed. "We can't afford unnecessary procedures. He's old. It's better to let nature take its course." Her words burned into me, hotter than the pain in my chest. I wanted to scream, to tell them I was still here, still fighting, but my body refused. My tongue was heavy, my throat locked. I could only watch as my life was weighed like currency in their hands. Daniel's silence sealed the verdict. He looked at the floor, his jaw tight, and said nothing. Nothing. The doctors hesitated, torn between duty and the signatures they needed. Finally, they pulled back, their faces grim. Daniel and Melissa left soon after, their footsteps fading down the sterile hallway. I lay there, surrounded by machines, yet more alone than I had ever been. Their absence was louder than their presence had ever been. But not everyone turned away. A nurse, young and kind-eyed, lingered at my side. She had been there when Melissa's cruel words cut through the room, when Daniel chose silence over compassion. I saw the shock in her face, the way her lips pressed together in anger she could not voice. She adjusted my blanket gently, her touch warm against the cold metal rails of the bed. "You're not alone," she whispered, though she knew I couldn't answer. Her words seeped into the fog of my mind like light through cracks in a shutter. For days, I drifted between darkness and fragments of sound. The beeping machines, the shuffle of nurses' shoes, the hollow echo of the hallways. Time lost meaning. Pain ebbed and flowed like tides, dragging me under, then letting me surface for air. And through it all, the image of Daniel's face, blank, indifferent, haunted me more than Melissa's cruelty. My own son, the boy I had once carried on my shoulders, had left me to die. I thought that was the end. I thought death had already stretched its hand toward me, and that I had nothing left but silence. But fate, it seemed, had one more door to open. The days that followed blurred into one another, like smudged ink on a letter never sent. I drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes floating in darkness, sometimes catching fragments of voices. The beeping machines became my clock, each sound a reminder that my body still clung stubbornly to life, even as my spirit trembled on the edge of surrender. In those hours of half-sleep, I dreamed of Linda. I saw her in the old kitchen, flour dusting her hair as she rolled out dough for biscuits. Her laughter was soft, the kind that warmed even the coldest days. She looked at me with eyes that still carried love, even from beyond the grave. "Robert," she said gently, "you're stronger than you think. Don't let go yet." I tried to reach for her, but she dissolved into light, leaving me with only the ache of absence. When I woke, tears dampened my pillow, and the sterile ceiling above me felt heavier than stone. Sometimes I heard Melissa's voice when she visited, though she rarely stayed long. She never spoke to me directly. Instead, she talked to Daniel or the doctors. Her words dipped in venom. "He's not worth the expense," she whispered once, not realizing I was half awake. "The sooner he passes, the sooner we can move on." My chest ached, not just from the illness, but from the cruelty that seemed to flow so easily from her lips. Daniel never contradicted her. His silence was a verdict louder than any sentence a judge could hand down. But someone else was listening. The young nurse, her name tag read Emily, had a gaze that held both sorrow and quiet fury. One evening, as Melissa repeated her cruel refrain, Emily slipped a small device from her pocket. I didn't realize what it was until later, but I saw the faint red glow of a recorder's light. She pressed it gently, capturing every poisoned word. At that moment, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't known in weeks: hope. Not for my body that felt beyond saving, but for justice, for truth. Emily became my silent guardian. She adjusted my pillow, spoke to me even when my eyes were closed, and treated me not as a fading patient, but as a man still worthy of dignity. Sometimes, when the pain grew unbearable, I felt her hand rest lightly on mine. "Hold on," she whispered once, her voice steady. "You're stronger than they think." Her words reminded me of Linda's, echoing across the chasm between life and death. I wanted to fight, but my body was failing me. Breathing felt like lifting weights. My chest rattled with each inhale, and exhaustion pulled me down like quicksand. There were moments when I longed for release, for silence, for the sweet embrace of Linda's memory. Yet every time I teetered on the edge, I thought of Melissa's words, "Just let him die," and something deep inside me rebelled. If I surrendered now, her cruelty would have the final word, and I couldn't let that happen. One night, I woke to the sound of Emily's voice, speaking softly to another nurse. "He deserves better than this," she said. "They left him here like an abandoned dog, but I won't forget. I'll make sure his story is heard." I couldn't open my eyes fully, but those words seeped into me, stronger than any medicine. For the first time in weeks, I felt less alone. Meanwhile, Daniel and Melissa's visits grew shorter and less frequent. They walked into my room like strangers forced to acknowledge a distant relative. Melissa often checked her watch, impatient, while Daniel kept his eyes on the floor. Their absence stung, but it also hardened me. If they wanted me gone, they would have to wait. I clung to life out of spite, out of stubbornness, out of the desperate need to see justice unfold. Every hour stretched into eternity, but Emily's kindness stitched small threads of strength into my unraveling soul. I began to sense that fate was weaving something larger, some pattern I couldn't yet see. The cruelty of my own family had brought me here, to the edge of death. But beside me stood a witness, a protector, and perhaps even a chance at redemption. I thought my story had ended on that hospital bed. I thought death had signed its name across my life. But fate had not finished writing. Somewhere in the distance, another chapter waited, and when it came, Daniel and Melissa would learn that abandoning me was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. When I finally opened my eyes, the world felt both foreign and familiar, like a place I had left long ago and returned to with a body that no longer belonged to me. The sterile ceiling, the sharp smell of antiseptic, the muted shuffle of nurses' shoes, it all came back in fragments, stitched together like pieces of a broken mirror. My chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, but each breath was a victory, a small rebellion against the death Melissa had wished upon me. At first, I didn't tell anyone. I let the doctors know I was awake, but when they offered to call my family, I shook my head. My lips were dry and cracked, but I managed to whisper, "Not yet." I wasn't ready to face Daniel. Not yet. His silence at my hospital bed had spoken volumes, and I wasn't sure I could survive hearing it again. So I stayed quiet, listening, observing, gathering strength not just in my body but in my heart. The days moved slowly. My body ached as though every muscle had been wrung out and left to dry. Physical therapy felt like learning to walk again on legs made of clay. But the nurses encouraged me, their hands steadying me when mine trembled. Among them, Emily remained my constant shadow, gentle, watchful, quietly protective. She never mentioned the cruel words she had recorded, but I could see in her eyes that she carried them like a torch, ready to light the truth when the time came. It was during one of those slow afternoons, as I sat by the window staring at the grey winter sky, that I met him. A young man in a suit walked into the ward, carrying a folder under his arm. He wasn't there for me. He had come to visit another patient, an elderly woman down the hall. But when he stopped by my room to ask for directions, our eyes met. Something in his expression softened when he saw me sitting there, frail but awake. "Sir, are you all right?" he asked. His voice carried the crisp confidence of someone used to speaking in courtrooms, but beneath it was genuine concern. I nodded, though my throat still burned when I spoke. "I've been better." A humorless chuckle escaped me, brittle as dry leaves. He stepped inside, introduced himself as Michael Harris, a junior attorney with a heart too big for his own good. What began as small talk, the weather, the slow recovery soon shifted when he asked if I lived with family. I hesitated, then told him the truth. The words poured out haltingly, like water from a cracked jar. I told him about Melissa's disdain, about Daniel's silence, about the hospital night when they chose to let me die. His brows furrowed, his jaw tightened, and when I finished, there was a heavy silence between us. Finally he said, "Mr. Miller, do you know that the house you live in, is it under your son's name or yours?" The question caught me off guard. For a moment, I was back in the lawyer's office years ago, signing papers to sell my father's land for Daniel's tuition, hands trembling but heart proud. I remembered carefully keeping the deed to my own house, the one Linda and I had built together, tucked away in a drawer like a sacred relic. "It's mine," I said slowly. "I never signed it over." Michael leaned forward, his eyes sharpening. "And have you written a will?" I shook my head. "Number, I always thought there would be time." A small smile touched his lips, but it wasn't of amusement. It was determination. "Then you still hold power, Mr. Miller. They can't touch that house, not legally. And if what you're saying about their neglect is true, you have more than just power. You have a case." The words lit something inside me, a spark that had nearly been extinguished. For weeks, I had lain in that bed believing I was nothing more than a burden, a man waiting to be discarded. But in that moment, I realized I still had leverage. I still had a voice, a weapon, even if it wasn't strength in my body. It was paper, ink, and truth. That night, as I lay in the dim glow of the hospital room, I thought of Linda again. I imagined her smile, the way she would rest her hand on mine when I doubted myself. "See?" she seemed to whisper. "You're not finished yet." I clutched the thin blanket to my chest and let silent tears fall, not of despair this time, but of defiance. The days that followed felt different. Each step in therapy carried purpose. Each meal I forced down was fuel, not just for survival, but for the fight ahead. Emily noticed the change in me. One evening, she placed a hand on my arm and said softly, "You look stronger." Did something happen? I nodded. I remembered something important. I'm not powerless. Her smile was gentle, but her eyes gleamed with pride. "Good. Hold on to that. They don't get to decide your worth." It's true. For the first time in months, I believed it. My son and daughter-in-law had tried to erase me, to silence me into the grave. But life had given me one more chance, and this time I swore I would not waste it. That was when I realized I still had one powerful weapon. The morning of the hearing dawned grey and heavy, the kind of sky that pressed down on the world like a warning. I arrived early, escorted by Michael, my lawyer, who walked with the calm confidence of a man carrying truth in his briefcase. My steps were slow, my cane clicking on the courthouse floor with the rhythm of a clock counting down. I had been many things in my life: a son, a husband, a father, a worker, but never before had I been a ghost brought back to life, walking into a room where everyone believed me long buried. The courthouse itself smelled of dust and varnished wood, its high ceilings echoing with whispers. I sat in the back, away from the curious eyes, wearing a plain suit that felt both foreign and protective. The fabric scratched against my skin, but I welcomed the discomfort. It reminded me I was still alive. My heart beat hard in my chest, not only from weakness, but from anticipation. For months I had been voiceless, dismissed as a burden, abandoned as though I were already dead. Today, I would speak. Today, I would be seen. Then came the sound of heels and polished shoes on marble. Daniel and Melissa entered together, their presence sweeping into the room like a storm dressed in silk. Daniel's suit was sharp, his hair trimmed and combed, his stride steady with the arrogance of a man who believed the world already belonged to him. Melissa clung to his arm, her perfume preceding her like an announcement. Her lips curved into a smile that glimmered with victory. They looked like royalty arriving to claim their throne. From my seat, I studied them the way one studies strangers who carry familiar faces. I remembered the boy Daniel once was, who had clutched my hand at county fairs, who had looked at me with awe when I lifted him high above my shoulders. Now that boy was nowhere to be found. In his place stood a man who had left me for dead, who had chosen silence when my life hung in the balance. Melissa's beauty was polished, but beneath it lay steel and cruelty. She glanced around the room, chin raised, as if daring anyone to question her right to sit at the center of it all. Their attorney, a man with silver hair and an expensive watch, approached them with the smoothness of a snake. Papers shuffled, whispers passed. I could almost hear Melissa's laugh, soft, satisfied, like someone who had placed the final piece of a puzzle. They believed I was gone. To them, today was a coronation, not a hearing. The courtroom filled slowly, the low hum of conversation rising like bees in a hive. Lawyers set up their files, clerks checked microphones, and the bailiff stood with arms folded. I sat still, every sound amplified in my chest. When the judge entered, we all rose, the scrape of chairs against the wooden floor like thunder rolling through the room. Melissa's hand tightened on Daniel's arm, her nails biting into his sleeve as though she were holding onto the very house she believed would soon be hers. The hearing began with formalities. Their attorney stood, voice slick as oil, and began to recite the story they had rehearsed. He spoke of the late Robert Miller, his tragic decline, the rightful inheritance due to his only son. My name, spoken as though already carved into stone, hung in the air like smoke. Each time it was uttered, I clenched the handle of my cane until my knuckles whitened. My breath came slow, measured, because if I let myself feel too much, I feared I might collapse before I had my chance. The judge nodded gravely, already reaching for the papers. It was as if the world had accepted my death without question, as if my voice had never mattered at all. And then Michael rose. "Your Honor," he said, his tone calm yet carrying weight. "Before we continue, there is one more witness who must be heard." The words landed like a stone in a still pond. Melissa's brow furrowed, her painted lips tightening. Daniel shifted in his seat, his smirk flickering uncertainly, though he leaned back as if unconcerned. The judge raised his eyebrows, a trace of irritation at the disruption. "Very well," he said. "Call your witness." Michael turned toward the back of the courtroom. His eyes found mine, and with the smallest nod, he gave me my cue. My chest tightened, but I pushed myself up, my cane striking the floor with a sound that seemed to slice through the silence. Every head turned. Conversations died, mid-sentence. The air grew heavy, thick with disbelief. Melissa's smile shattered first. The color drained from her cheeks, her body stiffening as though struck by lightning. Her hand gripped Daniel's arm so tightly he winced. Daniel's eyes widened, the mask of confidence peeling away, leaving behind the raw face of a man caught in a lie. I walked forward, each step slow but deliberate, like a drumbeat in a funeral march reversed. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, whispers darting like birds, startled into flight. My legs shook, but I leaned on the cane, letting the sound of its strike steady me. By the time I reached the front, the silence was complete. The entire room seemed to lean forward, waiting. I stood tall as my weary body allowed, and raised my chin. "I am Robert Miller," I said, my voice roughened by illness but strong with truth. "And I am not dead." The explosion of sound that followed was almost physical gasps, cries, the scrape of chairs as people leaned forward. Melissa's mouth opened, but no sound came. Daniel dropped his gaze to the floor, his shoulders curling inward, unable to meet my eyes. The judge leaned forward, his disbelief plain, his gavel tapping once to restore order. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice measured, "are you prepared to testify?" I gripped my cane tighter, feeling the weight of years, of sacrifices, of betrayals, all pressing into this moment. My chest swelled, and for the first time in too long, I did not feel like a ghost. I felt alive. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. My voice carried steady across the courtroom. "I am here to tell the truth of what was done to me." And as I spoke those words, I felt a surge of strength, not born of muscle or bone, but of justice. For the first time in months, perhaps years, I was no longer silent. The silence after my words was so thick it felt like the air itself had frozen. I stood at the witness stand, gripping my cane with both hands, staring out at the sea of faces. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then I began to speak, my voice rough but steady. I was a father who gave everything, I said. I broke my back on construction sites so my son could hold books instead of bricks. I sold the only land my father left me, land soaked with his sweat, so my son could sit in classrooms instead of labor yards. I thought my sacrifices would buy me love, or at least gratitude. But when I grew weak, I became nothing more than a burden. Murmurs rippled across the courtroom. Some people shook their heads, others leaned closer, caught in the gravity of the story. I kept going. I heard them whisper about nursing homes in the hallway of our house. I heard my daughter-in-law tell my son that only when I died would they have peace in their home. I collapsed from a stroke, and when the doctors asked for consent to save me, my family refused. They walked away and left me to die. Gasps erupted. The judge lifted his gavel but did not strike it, letting the weight of my words settle. Melissa's face flushed, then paled. Her fingers clawed at the table as though it could anchor her against the tide of truth. Daniel sat rigid, his head lowered, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitching. Then Michael, calm and precise, stepped forward. "Your Honor," he said, "words can be doubted, memories can be questioned, but sound does not lie." A nurse present at the hospital recorded the defendant's remarks. "With your permission, I would like to play it." The judge nodded gravely. The clerk pressed a button, and suddenly Melissa's voice filled the courtroom, cold and venomous. "This old man should just die already." The sentence echoed like a gunshot. Every head turned toward her. The jury's eyes hardened. A woman in the back row covered her mouth with her hand. I stood there trembling, not from weakness this time, but from the raw power of hearing aloud the contempt that had haunted me in silence. Melissa shook her head violently. "That was taken out of context," she cried, her voice shrill, desperate. "I didn't mean—" But the judge raised a hand, silencing her. "The recording is clear." His tone was iron. Her attorney leapt up, trying to salvage the wreckage. "Your Honor, my client was under stress. She was emotional. Surely we cannot hold every careless remark against her." The judge's eyes cut him down. This was not careless. This was cruelty, spoken while the man lay in a coma. His words struck like a hammer. I looked at Melissa then, and for the first time, her mask was gone. The woman who once smiled with polished confidence now shook uncontrollably, her face ashen, her eyes darting like a trapped animal searching for escape. And Daniel, my son, my blood sat with his head bowed so low it seemed he wanted to disappear. He would not meet my eyes. I stared at him, aching for him to look at me, to say something, to show a flicker of the boy I had raised. But there was nothing. Only silence. The same silence that had abandoned me in the hospital now sat beside me in the courtroom. I took a breath, the microphone carrying it to every corner of the room. "I was not asking for riches," I said softly. "I did not need luxury. I only wanted love, respect, a place in the home I helped build, and yet my own family wished me gone. Today, I stand not for vengeance, but for truth. Let the world see what happens when gratitude turns to greed, when love turns to neglect." The jury leaned forward, their faces etched with sympathy and anger. One older man in the front row nodded slowly, as though my pain was his own. The judge scribbled notes, his jaw set firm. Even the bailiff, who had stood expressionless all morning, now watched Melissa with visible disgust. The silence stretched long after I finished. Every heartbeat seemed to echo. Then I saw it, the thing I had never seen before: fear. It flickered in Melissa's eyes, wide and frantic. It darkened Daniel's face, his shoulders curling inward. For the first time, they realized they were not untouchable. They realized their cruelty had been dragged into the light. And in that moment, though my body was frail, though my heart still bore scars, I felt taller than I ever had. I was not the burden they tried to discard. I was not the ghost they thought buried. I was Robert Miller, alive, unbroken, and no longer silent. And for the first time, I saw fear in their eyes. When the judge's gavel came down for the final time, the sound was not just a sharp crack of wood on wood. To me, it was thunder rolling across a long and barren desert, rain finally breaking after years of drought. I closed my eyes for a brief moment and let it wash over me. That sound meant survival. It meant truth had clawed its way into the light, no matter how hard Daniel and Melissa had tried to bury it. The judge's words followed, deliberate and steady, like stones being laid into the foundation of something permanent. This court rules that the property remains in the legal ownership of Robert Miller. The petition for transfer of inheritance is denied. Furthermore, the evidence presented reflects clear neglect and intent to abandon. This judgment is final. Silence spread through the courtroom like a fog, thick and suffocating. I turned just enough to glimpse Melissa's face. She looked as if all the blood in her body had been drained at once, her skin pale, her lips quivering. She gripped Daniel's arm so tightly that her nails dug into the fabric of his suit. Daniel himself sat hunched forward, his eyes pinned to the floor as though it could swallow him whole. His once straight shoulders had caved in. For the first time, he no longer looked like the ambitious man in a tailored suit. He looked like a boy caught in a lie, exposed and powerless. Spectators whispered among themselves. I heard fragments of disbelief, even outrage. "How could they?" one woman muttered. "To their own father," said another. Heads turned toward Daniel and Melissa with open judgment, their reputations unraveling thread by thread in real time. When the session adjourned, Michael helped me rise. My legs wobbled, but not from fear. This time the trembling came from release, as if my body itself was exhaling after months of suffocation. "You stood tall, Mr. Miller," Michael whispered, steadying me with his arm. "You didn't just survive. You reminded everyone in this room what dignity looks like." I swallowed hard, unable to speak at first. My throat felt thick with tears that had waited too long to fall. Outside, the air was crisp, heavy with the scent of rain on the horizon. I tilted my head back, feeling the coolness against my face, and only then did the tears come. They were not tears of anger nor of joy. They were tears of release, the kind that cleanse rather than corrode. In the days that followed, the story spread through town faster than gossip ever had. People I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly stopped me in grocery stores or on the sidewalk, pressing my hands and saying, "We heard what happened. We're so sorry you went through that. We're glad you're still here." For the first time in a long while, I felt seen, not as a burden, not as a shadow at the edge of someone else's home, but as a man who had endured. Daniel and Melissa, however, found themselves living in a different kind of silence, the silence of doors closing, of phone calls unreturned, of neighbors who turned away instead of waving. Their names carried weight no longer, only shame. Daniel's colleagues, once eager to stand near him, now whispered behind his back. Opportunities dried up. Melissa's carefully curated circle of friends evaporated overnight. Even when they walked down their own street, curtains twitched and hushed voices followed. I did not take pleasure in their fall. Watching them unravel did not fill me with triumph. Instead, it left me with a hollow sorrow. This was not what I had dreamed for my son. I had dreamed of respect, of family, of warmth, passed from one generation to the next. Instead, he was left with a life crumbling beneath him, built not on love, but on ambition and cruelty. And then there was the house, my house, legally restored to me. Yet when I stepped onto its porch one last time, the walls seemed to lean in with shadows. Every room echoed with memories I could not bear to relive. Melissa's sharp words, Daniel's heavy silence, my own body collapsing in the living room. It was not a home anymore. It was a mausoleum of betrayal. So I made a decision. I sold it, not because I was forced to, but because freedom sometimes means letting go of the very thing you once clung to. With the money, I moved into a retirement community on the edge of town. It wasn't grand. The rooms were modest, the hallways narrow, the furniture simple, but the walls were alive with laughter. Every evening, voices carried down the corridors, someone playing piano in the lounge, a group of neighbors arguing over a card game, bursts of laughter echoing from the dining hall. It didn't take long before I made friends. Clara, a widow with quick wit, brought me tea and told stories about her years as a nurse. James, a retired teacher, challenged me to endless games of chess, each match a test of patience and memory. On Sunday mornings, a group gathered on the porch with coffee, sharing old war stories, lost loves, and the kind of wisdom only time can carve. I found myself smiling again, truly smiling. For the first time in years, people wanted me around, not because of obligation, not because of duty, but because of who I was. They valued my stories. They laughed at my jokes, even the bad ones. They looked for me at dinner. And I realized something: happiness had not abandoned me. It had simply been waiting for me elsewhere. Still, there were nights when dreams came, dreams of Daniel as a boy, running barefoot through the yard, his laughter bubbling like a creek. Dreams of him tugging my hand, calling me Dad, with that unshakable trust children carry before the world teaches them otherwise. I woke from those dreams with tears wetting my pillow, mourning not the man who betrayed me, but the boy I had once held. Did I hate him? Number hatred is a fire that consumes the one who carries it. What I carried instead was sorrow deep, unshakable sorrow for the path he had chosen. Perhaps one day he would look back and regret. Perhaps he would not. But that burden was no longer mine to carry. My battle had not been to change him. My battle had been to survive him, and in that I had succeeded. On quiet evenings in the retirement community, I sat with my new friends watching the sun bleed orange and gold across the horizon. We spoke sometimes, we laughed sometimes, and sometimes we simply let the silence be. And in those silences, I found something I had been denied for so long: peace. Peace not tied to inheritance. Peace not dependent on blood. Peace not borrowed from anyone else's approval. A peace that came from within, from the knowledge that I had lived through the fire and walked out alive. I learned something in those days. Family is not always written in blood. Sometimes it is written in love, in kindness, in the hand that steadies you when you stumble, in the voice that reminds you that you still matter. And in that truth, I found my home. If you've stayed with me through this story, you've walked alongside an old man who lost almost everything and yet found something greater than he ever expected. I began this journey broken, betrayed by the very blood I once believed would protect me. But I stand here now to tell you that betrayal is not the end. Sometimes it is the doorway to a new beginning. I used to believe that family was only defined by blood, by the ties of heritage and the weight of a shared name. But I learned painfully and slowly that family is so much more. Family is love given freely, respect offered without conditions, kindness shared when you are at your weakest. Sometimes those people carry your last name, sometimes they don't, and that's all right. If you are listening to me now, perhaps you carry wounds of your own. Maybe you've been forgotten by those you gave everything to. Maybe silence has cut deeper than any harsh word. To you, I say this: your value does not disappear just because someone else fails to see it. You are more than the neglect you've suffered. You are more than the pain you've endured. You still matter. I found peace not by clinging to the ones who abandoned me, but by opening my heart to those who chose to stand beside me. Strangers who became friends, friends who became family. They reminded me that love is not measured in bloodlines, but in actions, in presence, in compassion. So if your own story feels heavy, if you feel unseen, remember this: you are not alone. Somewhere out there, someone will see your worth. Somewhere out there, someone will remind you that your life still carries meaning. Do not give up before you find them. And if you are fortunate enough to still have your parents, your elders, the ones who built their lives around you, hold them close. Speak gratitude while they can still hear it. Because one day silence will fall and you'll wish you had said more. I am Robert Miller. My blood betrayed me, but life gave me another family, and that is enough.